Investigators demonstrated that prior to conditioning, little Albert had no fears of any animals, including, of course, white rats. Watson and Rayner then sought to teach Albert to fear white rats through classical conditioning. In the conditioning phase of the study, which was not filmed, the investigators struck a steel bar with a hammer whenever Albert reached for a rat, making a very loud noise that greatly upset and frightened Albert.
In 1920, a psychologist took a healthy 9-month-old baby and deliberately traumatized him to prove a theory. The experiment worked. The baby developed a lifelong phobia, and the psychologist never reversed the damage. That experiment is now banned, but it's just one of 5 psychological studies that were so cruel, so ethically devastating, that they can never be repeated. What's disturbing isn't just what these scientists did, it's what they discovered about human nature, because these experiments revealed truths about our psychology that we can't unlearn, truths that explain why good people do terrible things, why we obey authority even when it destroys us, and why isolation can break the human mind faster than any physical torture. Over the next 20 minutes, I'm going to walk you through 5 experiments that changed psychology forever and destroyed lives in the process. Some of these people never recovered. Some of these findings are still used to manipulate people today. And by the end, you'll understand exactly how fragile the human mind really is. Let's start with the baby. February 1920, Johns Hopkins University. Dr. John B. Watson had a theory that all human emotions are learned, not innate. He believed he could take any healthy infant and condition them to fear anything he wanted. So he found a test subject, a 9-month-old baby known in the study as little Albert. Albert was described as healthy, stable, and unusually calm. He didn't cry often. He wasn't afraid of animals. He was, by all accounts, a normal, happy baby. Watson wanted to change that. The experiment was simple. Show Albert a white rat. Let him play with it. Let him get comfortable. Then, the moment Albert reached for the rat, Watson's assistant would strike a metal bar with a hammer directly behind the baby's head, creating a loud, terrifying noise. Albert would scream and cry, and they'd do it again and again, over and over. After just 7 pairings of the rat with the loud noise, Albert became terrified of the rat. Even when there was no noise, he would cry and try to crawl away the moment he saw it. But it didn't stop there. The fear generalized. Albert became terrified of anything white and furry. Rabbits, dogs, a white fur coat, even a Santa Claus mask. Watson had successfully implanted a phobia into a baby's brain. And here's the worst part. Watson never reversed the conditioning. He never desensitized Albert. He never fixed what he'd broken. Albert's mother removed him from the study, and Watson lost contact with him. For decades, no one knew what happened to little Albert. But in 2012, researchers finally identified him. His real name was Douglas Merritt, and he died at age 6 from hydrocephalus, a condition he'd had since birth that Watson either didn't know about or didn't care about. Watson had experimented on a developmentally disabled child, traumatized him, and abandoned him. The little Albert experiment proved that fears can be conditioned. It laid the foundation for behavioral psychology, but it also revealed something darker, that in the pursuit of knowledge, some scientists will sacrifice anything, even an innocent child's mental health. This experiment would never be approved today, but the damage was already done. 1939, University of Iowa. Dr. Wendell Johnson was studying stuttering. He had a theory that stuttering wasn't genetic, it was learned through negative reinforcement. If you tell a child they speak badly, they'll develop a stutter. He wanted to prove it. So, he designed an experiment that would deliberately create stuttering in children who spoke normally. 22 orphans were selected. Orphans were used because they had no parents to object. Half were children who already stuttered. The other half spoke perfectly. The children were divided into groups. Some received positive speech therapy, encouragement, praise, support, but others received what Johnson called negative therapy. Every time these children spoke, they were told they were stuttering, even when they weren't. They were criticized, mocked, told their speech was defective and that they should be ashamed. Don't speak unless you can do it right. You're becoming a stutterer. Notice how your words get stuck. These were normal children with no speech problems. But after months of constant negative reinforcement, many of them developed speech problems that lasted the rest of their lives. Mary Tudor, Johnson's graduate student who conducted the experiments, later described the children's psychological breakdown. They stopped speaking in class. They became withdrawn and anxious. Their confidence was shattered, and it never came back. One subject, Hazel Potter, described the lifelong impact decades later. She said the experiment destroyed her self-esteem, made her terrified of speaking in public, and created psychological damage she carried for 70 years. The experiment proved Johnson's hypothesis. You can create a stutter through psychological abuse, but at what cost? The study was never published during Johnson's lifetime. His colleagues called it the monster study because of how unethical it was. Johnson knew he'd crossed the line, so he buried the research. It wasn't until 2001 that the University of Iowa publicly apologized to the survivors. Some received financial settlements, but no amount of money could undo the damage. The monster study revealed that words can be as destructive as physical harm, that authority figures can implant psychological disorders through nothing but criticism, and that some experiments cause permanent damage that no apology can fix. Yale University. Stanley Milgram wanted to understand how the Holocaust happened, how ordinary people became complicit in atrocities, how normal citizens followed orders to hurt and kill. So he designed an experiment to test obedience to authority. Participants were told they were part of a study on learning and memory. They were assigned the role of teacher. Another person, actually an actor working with Milgram, was the learner. The teacher's job was simple: ask the learner questions. Every time they got an answer wrong, deliver an electric shock, and with each wrong answer, increase the voltage. The shocks started at 15 volts, mild, barely noticeable, but they escalated. 30 volts, 60, 120. The shock machine went all the way up to 450 volts, labeled XXX, danger, severe shock. The learner was strapped into a chair in another room. The teacher couldn't see them, but they could hear them. And here's what happened. At 75 volts, the learner grunted in pain. At 120 volts, they shouted that the shocks were painful. At 150, they demanded to be released. At 300 volts, they screamed and refused to answer any more questions. After 315 volts, there was only silence. The participants, the teachers, were visibly distressed. They sweated, they trembled. They questioned the experiment. But whenever they hesitated, the experimenter, a man in a lab coat with a calm, authoritative voice, gave them simple commands. Please continue. The experiment requires that you go on. You have no other choice. You must continue. And they did. 65% of participants went all the way to 450 volts. They believed they were delivering potentially lethal shocks to another human being. They heard the screams, they heard the silence, but they obeyed. The shocks weren't real. The learner was an actor. But the participants didn't know that. They genuinely believed they were hurting someone, and they did it anyway because an authority figure told them to. Milgram's experiment revealed something terrifying about human nature. We are wired to obey authority, even when it violates our morals, even when it causes harm, even when every instinct tells us to stop. The participants weren't monsters. They were regular people, students, professionals, ordinary citizens, but under the right conditions. A lab coat, a calm voice, a sense of legitimate authority. They became willing participants in cruelty. Many of the participants suffered psychological trauma after learning the truth. They had to confront the fact that they were capable of inflicting harm simply because someone told them to. The Milgram experiment is still studied today. It explains how genocides happen, how corporate crimes occur, how systems of abuse persist because people follow orders. But the cost was real psychological harm to the participants. Harm that Milgram knew he was causing, and he did it anyway. 1967. University of Pennsylvania. Martin Seligman was studying behavioral conditioning in dogs. He wanted to understand how organisms respond to inescapable stress. So he designed a 3-stage experiment. Stage 1. Dogs were placed in a harness and given electric shocks at random intervals. They couldn't escape. They couldn't avoid the shocks. They could only endure. Stage 2. The dogs were placed in a box divided by a low barrier. One side delivered shocks, the other side was safe. All they had to do was jump over the barrier to escape. Normal dogs, dogs that hadn't been through stage 1, figured this out immediately. They jumped the barrier and avoided the shocks. But the dogs from stage 1 didn't even try. They just lay down and accepted the pain. Even though escape was possible, even though the barrier was low enough to step over, they had learned that resistance was futile. They had learned to be helpless. Seligman called this learned helplessness, and it explained a devastating aspect of human psychology. When people are subjected to prolonged, inescapable stress, abuse, poverty, oppression, they stop trying to escape. Even when opportunities arise, they remain passive. They've internalized the belief that nothing they do matters. This discovery had massive implications. It helped explain depression, domestic abuse dynamics, and systemic oppression. Learned helplessness is why victims stay in abusive relationships. It's why people remain in poverty even when opportunities exist. It's why entire populations accept authoritarian rule. But the cost of this knowledge was the suffering of those dogs. They were deliberately traumatized to prove a theory. And while the findings helped millions of people understand their own psychology, the experiment itself was an act of cruelty. Today, experiments like this face strict ethical review. But in the 1960s, there were no rules. Scientists could torture animals in the name of progress, and they did. 1960s, University of Wisconsin. Harry Harlow was studying attachment and social development in monkeys. His previous experiments had shown that infant monkeys preferred a soft cloth, mother over a wire mother that provided food, proving that emotional comfort mattered more than physical sustenance. But Harlow wanted to go further. He wanted to understand what happened when social bonds were completely severed. So he built what he called the Pit of Despair. It was a vertical isolation chamber, a stainless steel tank with sloped sides that made climbing impossible. Infant monkeys were placed inside alone, no contact with other monkeys, no visual stimulation, no interaction of any kind. Some stayed for 30 days, others for up to a year. The results were catastrophic. Monkeys isolated for just 30 days showed severe psychological damage. They rocked back and forth. They refused to interact with other monkeys when released. Monkeys isolated for longer periods never recovered. They became completely withdrawn. They couldn't form relationships. They couldn't function socially. Some starved themselves to death, even when food was available. Harlow had proved that social isolation during critical developmental periods causes permanent psychological damage. This had massive implications for understanding human development, orphanages, and solitary confinement. But the cost was the complete psychological destruction of living beings. Harlow himself reportedly suffered from depression later in life. Some speculate that the cruelty of his own experiments haunted him, but he never publicly expressed remorse. The Pit of Despair experiments revealed that social connection isn't optional for mental health. It's fundamental. Isolation doesn't just cause discomfort, it destroys the mind. This knowledge shaped policies on childcare, prison reform, and mental health treatment, but it came at the cost of unspeakable suffering. These 5 experiments share a common thread. Scientists prioritized knowledge over ethics. They caused real harm to babies, children, dogs, monkeys, and ordinary people in pursuit of understanding, and they succeeded. These experiments revealed fundamental truths about human psychology that we still rely on today. We know fear can be conditioned because of little Albert. We know negative reinforcement destroys confidence because of the monster study. We know humans obey authority to dangerous extremes because of Milgram. We know that prolonged helplessness breaks the will because of Seligman. And we know isolation destroys the mind because of Harlow. But we also know that knowledge has a cost, and sometimes that cost is too high. Today, institutional review boards exist to prevent experiments like these. Informed consent is mandatory. Psychological harm, vulnerable populations, children, prisoners, people with disabilities have protections. But these rules exist because of the horrors that came before them. The scientists who conducted these experiments weren't necessarily evil. They believed they were advancing human knowledge. They thought the ends justified the means, but they were wrong. Because science without ethics isn't progress. It's cruelty with a hypothesis. These experiments can never be repeated, and they shouldn't be, but their findings remain. Embedded in psychology textbooks, referenced in research papers, used to understand human behavior. We benefit from knowledge gained through suffering, and we have to live with that uncomfortable truth. By the way, if you're into this, stick around. Next week, I'm breaking down the psychological trick that cult leaders use to make normal people abandon their families. It's the same tactic used in high-pressure sales, toxic relationships, and even some corporate environments. That's it for this one. If you made it this far, you're exactly the kind of person this channel is for someone who wants to understand the darker side of human psychology, not just skim the surface. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next breakdown. And drop a comment. I want to know which experiment disturbed you the most. Or if there's a psychological topic you want me to cover next. This channel grows because of you. This is The Dark Mind. Stay curious, stay ethical, and I'll see you in the next one.